Okay, so to finish out the section on myths of race, I don't know if I suggested the last one was, but the case for reparations is what I wanted to close this out with. It is a single reading, but it's pretty involved. I appreciated the argumentative structure on this. I also appreciated um, the argument itself. I think it does a good job of breaking down the history, even though it is, again, from a particular perspective, but that perspective, if you think about it, has been a marginalized perspective, right? So even subjective perspectives on histories that have been marginalized are pretty important because they sort of set the record straight, right? That objective idea of history, I'm hoping you're starting to understand, is a little bit something that we've been shying away from overall, at least in terms of approaching these topics. But again, I'll focus a little bit more on argumentative structure so that we can at least have a basis for hanging all of this stuff off of. Okay, so I'm going to move on to, hopefully that'll come up, a little bit of background. This particular essay is pretty well known, at least in academic circles. It starts off with some ideas about other reparations that were paid because that idea of reparations itself is a charged term. Even the writer acknowledges that because initially in the little introduction that I don't know if I signed per se, but some of you read. The idea of reparations he was against, right, when he first thought about it, and or when he was thinking about it. And then he did a little research and he realized that there were other reparations that had been paid historically, and that the case for reparations was actually stronger than the case to not allow for reparations. So it's a pretty nice logical argument in that sense, right? You know, he comes in as he presents himself as a doubter and says that these are the arguments that convinced him, and this is kind of where he took that argument. He begins structurally by identifying particular quotes. I think we talked a little bit about how those different quotes balance each other. Deuteronomy is biblical. John Locke is a political thinker, early American Enlightenment political thinker. And then there's an anonymous code, right? Offsetting all of those different things. So the other thing that he does do, at least initially, that I was able to notice, and I gave you guys some idea about how this whole thing was going to work rhetorically, was that he uses sort of Roman numerals, and I think that's taken pretty directly from the original. I don't think that was accidental. To me, it echoed the idea of articles, right? Articles of the Constitution, right? That kind of thing. It's articles, I guess, of impeachment. You know, that's how they refer to these really official American documents that are borrowed from. That structure is borrowed from the sort of Roman, you know, classical approach. So that's one thing to notice is that this very modern argument is being presented as sort of a classical argument, right? Very organized. So that's just one of my losses. In this series of slides, I break down the different sections. I highlight either titles or quotes at the beginning, so that and some terms, so that it draws you toward those. Okay. So there's some terms like kleptocracy that aren't necessarily invented terms because they've been used before, but they are a combination of different words. I don't remember what the formal term for that is, but kleptocracy, right? That means klepto is stealing, right? Ocracy is a system of government, you know, I don't know. That's just a thumbnail definition. Don't hold me to that. But the idea is that this is an organized stealing, right? That the government was basically an organized. Maybe it's a little extreme to say it was a lynch mob, but an organized stealing from one people's to another. In this case, specifically the riches of the African American experience. Right? We can even get a little philosophical with it. So he does spend time establishing individual people. That is something that I am drawn to, in the sense that the subjective approach that I talked about before and how important it can be It's especially considering that the way we ended, the semester with a story, right? And that was not accidental. Remember what we talked about when we talked about stories and how stories themselves hold a particular power for us. And so individual stories bring up that idea of, not only just officially pathos and, logos lends authority because you're having a first person perspective, somebody that actually existed during that time. That's a pretty valuable primary source, at least historically. So that's one thing to notice about this, and one connection that I could pretty easily make. It's like, pick two readings that actually had that, right? That subjective first person, or at least close to first person perspective, even if in the sense of telling one person's story to represent a larger idea. That is certainly something that piques my interest. And when I say piques my interest, should pique your interest too, right? Because I'm the one coming up with the final. So that is another thing to keep in mind, is that would be an easy way for me to allow you to bridge some of these readings. And I'm going to move on here. This is the title is a bit of a repeat. It's just a continuation of some of the highlights. If you've done the reading, none of these are necessarily comprehensive, right? These are just sort of things that are being pointed, that I'm pointing out. And it's important for you to at least look at these, because when I do come up with the final, these are the things I'm going to be looking at, right? So if I get stuck on a question, and I want it to be a little more specific, I may wind up going back to this and saying, okay, we talked about that. Okay, then I can put that in there in the question, right? So that's one of the reasons why, if nothing else, you want to go through these, because these are just ways that I'm going to be helping to specify some of the questions, because it's real easy to ask a broad question for an in-class final purely. That would be easy for me to do, right? Just the question that I just told you. Pick two things, and if it's open book, right, it's fine, right? I can just say pick two readings that do something, right? But in this case, I'm assuming that it's a take-home, right? So if I do something like that, yeah, built into that is a little bit of unique perspective, but I'm assuming that you can actually look at some of these a little bit more carefully than just sort of, rushing through something, right? And then, picking something out, anything, right? I'm assuming that you have a little bit more time than that, right? It's not like necessarily a panic flurry. So it is really useful for you to go back to this and look at some of these, even if I'm just sort of clicking through these a little bit fast. Just in the interest of time and sort of your time and my time, right? This is a review session. So the section 2, a difference of kind, not degree. Those titles, I think in class I told you I kind of like, because they tell a lot, but they don't necessarily tell much if you don't actually read the section, right? So that title, a difference of kind, not degree, if you hadn't read it and you just looked at that title, it may not make much sense to you, but then you read it and then you go back and go, okay, that's referencing that particular idea. So that's how titles can be very useful, right? To allow for a little bit more of review, sort of an immediate review, right? Because they set up the argument in a way that's abstract and sometimes, and then after you read it, you realize that they're a lot more specific, right? At least in terms of how you're rhetorically approaching it as an audience, right? There's an expectation that that's going to happen with titles. So section 5, quiet plunder. As you can see, I'm not reviewing all of the sections. I'm assuming you read the whole thing. Or at least the parts that I told you to, but these highlights are really what I'm going to hold you responsible for, if, not every single thing, but I'm assuming that, if I do reference something here, you'll at least have an idea of what that means. So review it to the extent that you are familiar with this, but don't review it to the extent that you think I'm gonna tell you what page did that come from, what section is that. Although I could, but it's more of an exercise than it is sort of a physical exercise than it is anything else. I mean, if I asked you that on a take-home, you could just, it would just take you time to do that, right? I would just be saying, which section did blank come from, and then given an infinite amount of time, which theoretically you could have, you could look that up. That's not my intention with the final. Okay, my intention is not to to have you do a search and find, because it's not entirely useful to your critical faculties. It's a good way for me to waste your time if I really want you to prove to me that you're smart enough to look up stuff. But as you can tell by this class, hopefully, I'm asking for maybe a little bit more than that in terms of your critical faculties. Sorry about that. I am in my garage, so I'm seeing some flies here. So anyway, that's what I got for you. I'm gonna leave it there, just so that you guys have a general idea of how I might be using this particular piece. Okay, so we'll continue with culture and subculture in the next video, and I think this will conclude what I'm posting for now, and then that will be released as well. Okay, thank you.